where strategy gaming meets good vibes. No stress, just critical moves.
Welcome to Critical Moves podcast. I'm your host here, Timothy, and I'm joined by Nuno. Can you say hi?
Hello, guys.
Al.
Hi, strategy gamers.
And Joe.
Hey, everybody.
We're here today to talk about the big elephant in the room, the RTS Renaissance. We've all played the old classics, we've all had a tough dry spell in the middle, and we've all played some of the new exciting strategy games out there. And we're here joined together to talk a bit about what happened. First and for all, Renaissance, what is that? It's a rebirth. To have a rebirth, you need the birth itself. So, mid-90s to late 90s, were some very hard-hitting games. What do you guys remember from that time?
Can you just say Renaissance again, because it just sounds so beautiful?
Well, it is French for rebirth, and a very significant meaning, I would say, in time and in RTS gaming. The golden age, I would say, was indeed mid-90s to late 90s, maybe early 2000s. Some very big names, Blizzard, Ensemble Studios, Westwood. What do you guys play from that? What do you remember? What were some really good memories from that time?
I absolutely agree. And I fell into the Westwood camp over the Blizzard camp. I never really got away with fantasy, so the Warcraft games never really gelled with me. But Red Alert was the first RTS game I played. It was one of my first PC gaming experiences, and it was just so different. It was just so different from everything else that had come before in my gaming career, and it sparked a lifelong passion or love affair for RTS games with Red Alert. It was just that the Frank Koplecki, is that how you say it? Koplecki? The Hell March.
Hell March, iconic,
just absolutely fantastic. And I think the opening bars of that, I was just sucked into that universe. It was just fantastic.
What I think contributed greatly to the success of RTS is that it differentiated itself from like Civilization 1. That was a slow-paced, turn-based strategy game. And I think from the 90s, there was a technical capacity to do this real-time strategy gaming. The mouse helped tremendously with all that. And then it differentiated itself by being very dynamic, whereas previous games, you had to think a lot about it, whereas with RTS games, it was dynamic, you had to think on the spot, you had to address the issues in real time. Do you have good experiences with that? Tell us a little bit, Joe, what changed for you if you played some turn-based games versus some RTS games?
So I played both the Blizzard games and the Red Alert games. And I also played this horribly difficult Warhammer game, Shadow of the Horned Rat. That was just, I don't know how much time I spent on that, but it was really something that I just got hooked on that game. I didn't really discover a lot of turn-based games until later, unless you count, Civilization, but it was really the RTS stuff that really got me in the Age of Empires and things like that.
Right, Age of Empires is not a really big one. I think one that has stood the test of time until now, Age of Empires, Nuno, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, I think I fall more onto the Ensemble Studios camp, mainly because I never got my hands on the Blizzard titles, and this is a curious story because in Portugal you have a very hard time getting new games back then, so only the biggest titles were on sale because you have to buy them at brick and mortar stores, so Steam wasn't a thing in the 90s. So the only game I could find was Age of Empires and Age of Empires 2 back then. So I just started playing Age of Empires way back when, and that was the game that started my love affair. First with RTS games, and then afterwards with strategy gaming as a whole. I think like, for me, Age of Empires is the defining RTS, like the one that took whatever formula was before it and just perfected it to the next level, and that's something you can still see today. So, and I might be getting ahead of myself, but like Age of Empires 2 or an Age of Empires 4 is precisely Age of Empires 2, but with a added layer of complexity and some tweaks here and there, some active abilities. But other than that, if you strip like all the modernity from Age of Empires 4, you're going to find Age of Empires 2 underneath. Like just new graphics and a couple of active abilities here and there, and just some tweaks to the way like you can put your soldiers on walls. Also,
So that's definitely something I think we should come back to when we're talking about Renaissance, about what stayed and what was good and what was refined. But if we're staying with Age of Empires 1, Warcraft 2, StarCraft, Total Annihilation, what made it so good then? Like, because it was a huge success, it was a very big portion of PC gaming at the time.
and I think you had mostly like two camps of gamers or players way back then, because you had consoles on one end, and like consoles weren't the home of strategy. Like you couldn't play. You still can't properly play strategy games with a controller.
You gotta have the mouse.
Yeah, you gotta have the mouse. You need the keys for the microing, and it's very hard to play games. Like I know that a couple of companies later tried to port their games to consoles, and they always failed. So I think you had like these two camps of people. Some that were older folks that were playing on PC, like Al. Back then, and like you had the newest generation that was playing consoles like maybe Sega Saturn, Nintendo, and all that. So I think that's one of the reasons why RTS still lives on PC and not on console. I think that the controls are very particular, and this eventually comes around to why RTS started to fall.
For me, the whole reason why RTS games were successful was there was this constant innovation. There was when you look at the first couple of titles like Dune 2, then you look at Westwood's next title, Command and Conquer. The innovations in terms of being able to select multiple units was a massive step forward. The fluidity of controls was a massive step forward. And then when you move onwards and you look at Total Annihilation, where you had that king piece, that commander unit, which was so ultra powerful, but also so ultra vulnerable as well. The maps increased in size. You had 3D elevation. You had the range of weapons changing based upon how high the unit that was firing it was. There was innovation upon innovation upon innovation across all three of the main streams of RTS games. And again, getting ahead of ourselves, maybe one of the reasons why this did fail was because they ran out of innovations, and you went from this is something new to this is a regurgitation of what we've seen before.
I would say that the next innovation in practically all video games after that, early 2000s, was a transition to 3D. And perhaps that did go quite tough on RTS. If we're thinking about the transition to 3D in RTS games, most games had to stay in some kind of 2D. When we think about Age of Empires 2 even, it is like a pretend 3D, but it is actually like a fully 2D game.
Isometric.
And exactly. And then I think one of the first successful 3D games that I can think of is something like Warcraft 3. And that worked, but it wasn't very beautiful, I would say.
Yeah, I think the transition to 3D was particularly tough on strategy games because or for RTS, because they don't lend themselves perfectly for the new dimension. And if you look at the first 3D games, so Stronghold 2, for example, when those games look terrible, even Rise of Nations,
Absolutely.
which is a fantastic title, it still looks really bad, and it looked really bad back when. Um, so I think we gotta ask ourselves is what did 3D actually added to the RTS genre other than just new graphics? And I don't mean to sound like an old guy because I really love like beautiful graphics in game, but I don't think it added a lot because for the most part you're playing RTS games from 2D or you're using an isometric perspective even if the game is actually um, a 3D title. I think one game that managed to get away from that, and that's because of the spectacle and the size, was Total War. So Total War did 3D really well because it knew how to explore the 3D. So they knew that there was some spectacle, people were looking for that, and they capitalized on it. It's not that Total War was a better strategy or a better RTS games than others, but just it looked really incredible for the time, and I'm talking about like Rome Total War, not Shogun or Medieval. But those games brought a level of spectacle that I don't think you had seen before, and particularly because they were historical, so they weren't sci-fi like other titles. So I think this brings like an interesting level of realism and proximity you can have with the games.
Would it be fair to call Total War an RTS game? It's certainly not a
Yes.
classical RTS game, but it does this weird thing where it's both turn-based and real-time tactics. One would say, but it did do that well. I think there's a couple other ones that did it well. But then I think the big innovation for using that newfound computing power was perhaps scale. You guys can think of some games that you enjoyed that had like a whole newfound scale to it.
Well, he talked about Rome. One of the key things for me when Rome came out, I remember reading about it back when instruction manuals came with games, that each little man would have his own little fight. And I remember thinking that was just the coolest thing I could imagine on a game, whereas I could watch these little men fight their battles rather than just having the units collide and then eventually one of them disappears. They were having their battles on there. And that was a huge innovation for me with Rome Total War. And that's why I would say it probably did fit more under an RTS than the turn-based, is because the turn-based part was like an afterthought for Rome. Whereas most people, I think, felt like the meat and potatoes of that game was the battles.
I asked that question on rtshq.net. Are the Total War games RTS games? And the people are split because I always consider them to be turn based because the real time battles are optional. You don't have you can auto resolve. You don't have to do the RTS section of Total War to enjoy the Total War experience. So I'm still on the fence. I still class them as turn based. But anyway, let's move on from Total War because
isn't that a bit what happened with RTS games is that after the 90s there was new ways to make a game that were found, new gameplay mechanics, and people kind of integrated that in their new games and tried to go in all different directions, and all sorts of new sort of games were found in the 2000s. Some that explore more the 4X element of it. I'm thinking something like Star Wars Empire at War. Some that were more going towards, well, I mean, you had the huge MOBA thing as well, which originates from an RTS custom-made map, basically. And it kind of took the RTS elements and then went in a different direction with that. And there's quite a few others. There's a lot of failed attempts. I don't know if you guys tried games such as like Sacrifice. That was like a hybrid RTS game, but also a first-person kind of game. and that failed, and then others succeeded, such as the MOBA that succeeded greatly. So it's kind of like RTS evolved into a lot of different new things.
Well, I think this is what we were talking about in relation to innovations, and RTS it ran out of innovations, and the only thing it could do was diverge.
I disagree.
Which is where MOBA came in.
I disagree with that.
Nuno, what do you think?
I don't think that RTS just stopped like innovating, because you can find innovations like until today. I think like if you draw a timeline of great RTSs, I think you're always going to find innovations. And since we're already like reaching the mid 2000s here, I think like, for example, Company of Heroes came out in 2006, just prior to computers starting to fall off in favor, and MOBA started to go on the rise, with League of Legends launching into its beta sometimes during 2008, 2009. I think I might be misconstrued on this one, but I think it was around this. So I think you always find great titles, and you have also very memorable ones like Black and White came out, I think 2007 maybe. And that was a great and very successful title. I think it just started to branch out. So you had RTS, you had turn-based and RTS, and Civilization with 4X. And then you start to see people trying to mix things up. And I think that's where some other titles started to falter a bit. Sure, Joe.
Did you guys ever catch that failed Command and Conquer first-person RTS game that all they did was make a demo?
Renegade.
Yeah. The demo was so cool.
I loved it as well. It was. It gave a really cool perspective, because it gave like a very personal perspective to a game that you've played for so long, looking very far away, and then suddenly you're in the middle of it.
I'm embarrassed to say I was heartbroken when it never came out. Just devastated.
So let me ask a question then. If Nuno thinks that RTS has continued to innovate, and I think it hasn't, let me ask Joe, why do you think that RTS games fell by the wayside?
You know, like the same reason why you don't see any comedies right now in movies is because they just thought they could make more money at a lower cost point making other games, you know? And multiplayer became such a big deal, you know? They were like, oh, we can mail in the campaigns of all these games and focus heavily on multiplayer, and we'll make a lot more money because people want to beat each other, you know? And they just found out that they could make other things. That's what I think.
So about that, actually, I think that something like StarCraft 2 kind of kept the torch going for this kind of environment of like competitive 1-versus-1 strategy games. But I think that there's a very big portion of gamers that are not interested in this like very high responsibility, very highly competitive 1-versus-1 pure mechanical gameplay that requires a lot and kind of crushes you if you're not playing like really, really well right out the gate. And then I think that there's a lot of other games there that picked up a lot of the RTS games. We're still within the strategy genre, but offered things like diplomacy, for example, and the Paradox games. They picked up a lot of games that didn't offer this like highly competitive 1-versus-1 gameplay. And then you have the MOBAs that offered also a lowered responsibility, where you didn't have to control dozens of units, but you just had like one unit where you're part of a team. So you're only part of a responsibility with a single unit. And I think that this 1-versus-1 playstyle might not appeal to that large of a population. Then you also have the city builders. City builders have been really big, and even within RTS, you have some successful games like the Settlers that were closer to city builders. I don't know if you guys played these. So I think it diverged a lot, and if you define RTS very strictly, it might seem like it died out, but I think perhaps it simply diverged into a bunch of different subgenres.
So it evolved.
Exactly.
Yeah, it became MOBAs, and don't forget that we're not talking just about like strategy games might be a genre all of their own, but they're competing with other genres, and this is the moment where you start to see the rise of competitive first-person shooters. So, as like in the early 2000s, you start to see Medal of Honor, you start to see Call of Duty mainly, and like these games dominated the gaming medium, and they still do to this very day. So. RTS started to having to compete with that, and don't forget that we reached the point where eventually, like you start. So we can forget that at this time, like it was very hard to buy games online. Like you didn't have Steam, you didn't have like all these stores you have today, so you still had to buy games at brick and mortar store, and eventually these brick and mortar stores started to stock more like console titles because those were the ones that sell the most. So games started to the strategy games had to compete for the shelf space with these titles, and they just lost the battle. And this is why we started to see like a resurgence just a couple of years later, like in the early 2010s, and just because the rise of Steam and just Steam opened up the market for new games to come out.
For me, the RTS journey kind of mirrors society in some respects, because we've become this society which requires and demands instant gratification, and you don't get that from real-time strategy. It requires thought. It requires you to multitask. It requires critical thinking. You don't just pick up a joypad and blast away at your mates or against random strangers from the other side of the world and get that instant dopamine hit of success or failure. You don't see that in RTS games. I mean, even some of the games like Battle Aces, which is a new one coming out. Games are only 10 minutes long. 10 minutes is a long time to be playing a competitive match in a game, especially something which is high intensity.
I was going to say, it's so funny that you talk about how fast people want their payoff in games now. When I played the original RTS games, I was a turtler. Like, I would collect all of the Tiberium before I was attacking anybody, and then I just had this huge overwhelming force. The patience I had as a little kid is pretty outrageous to think about, because like you said, now I would be like, oh, who's got the time for that?
And I think that's exactly where a lot of the players went, is like they're interested in building, they're interested in like making a city, like not as much in this big attacking competitive 1-versus-1 gameplay, right? I mean, a lot are. Don't get me wrong. StarCraft 2 still is really popular, and the most popular part of StarCraft 2 is that 1-versus-1 competition scene. But yeah, tower defense, for example, that's a big subgenre where people play tower defense and just want to sit back and build something and survive to the next wave or whichever. Phone games, by the way, are really huge nowadays, and tower defense is one of those. And then on the other side, the RTS game kind of sits like very delicately, I would say, between the turn-based strategy where you're like sitting and pondering your next move and maybe calculating, oh, in 3 turns I will be doing this, and then the very action-oriented shooter and MOBA and so on. So it's like a very delicate balance between the two. That's difficult.
It's trying to appeal to both types of gamers, the thinker and the action, and failing to achieve either aim.
Or this better option simply.
I think like while I can see the point of how, I don't think that's necessarily the case, because you have some titles that manage to bring a balance. You just need to tone down like how fast does the game play. And I think we can go back to the Total War as a great example of a game that was really really slow paced in the beginning, so battles took quite a while. So let's compare like Rome 1 and Rome 2. Rome 1 battles could last for 20 to 30 minutes each battle, and if you play Rome 2, like battles, if battles last 10 minutes, you're lucky. So I think that's actually more of a game design fault than necessarily like the players, because I think we came to the conclusion as a whole that players enjoy slower paced games, right? So I think there's a lot of no.
Absolutely, 100% disagree. You look at the titles which are released. RTS games are, as you would class them to be, the most action orientated of all strategy games. RTS games are nowhere near as popular as any of your first-person shooters, third-person shooters, action adventures. They simply do not have the appeal that these games have with the next generation of gamers.
Yeah, because it's a very taxing genre, right? So you need to learn how to play. If you have 20 civilizations, it's very different to learn like 5 different builds for a game for each civilization instead of just learning how to shoot your M4 in Call of Duty. It's very different, and I think it's the upfront investment you need to put forward to enjoy these games. And I think if you don't have a baseline to understand, and if you don't have this history that some of us do, it's a hard sell.
I was just going to say, you bring up an interesting point there, the two of you actually. One of the things that has come more recently, I'm jumping way ahead, but just for a second, is I feel like a lot of the more successful games have found a way to come up with different factions or different civilizations that, there is one that's the slow methodical, and then there's another one that's the Zerg. Like if you play a newer Total War 3, Khorne is a total Zerg faction, right? It's there's no breaks, you're just all fighting. But then if you play the dwarves, you're back to long fights and you're building up and you're grinding. I think those are the most successful ones, are the ones that try to do that.
So that's the next really good question, is like, okay, now we do see a resurgence of a lot of RTS titles coming back. We just talked about it in the last episode with the remasters. I think that's a very big part of it. People feel very nostalgic towards, I would say, the quote-unquote golden era of RTS games. But also new titles, new franchises are coming in and are building something new. What's different? What works? What lessons did they learn? Why are people coming back to their genre? And what didn't work? Like we just talked about what didn't work, but now let's talk about what does work.
I think we need to look at several factors here as to why RTS came back. And I don't think RTS came back just because games started being made. I think that first of all was like the advent of Steam. So Steam came around, Steam started to dominate the PC gaming space, and without Steam there wouldn't be an RTS renaissance. That this is, for me, it's so clear. Because Steam allowed for other titles to shine, and these are not necessarily RTS, but they are related. So 2012 you have XCOM, and XCOM was a massive title because XCOM had been dead for 15 years, and XCOM alone introduced like a new audience to strategy games. Of course, turn-based strategy, but still a new audience to the strategy games. And you start to see some people, they drip into 4X and they drip into RTS. I think that XCOM is such a cultural pillar in strategy gaming that I think we can't ignore it. And it was a massive success because of Steam. Then in 2012, you have Crusaders Kings. And then you have Europa Universalis. And I think that these three titles forged the way forward to strategy games. And it's after these three, the massive success of these three, that you start to see new RTS games being made. And then you have like some small experiments here and there. like for example, I remember Northgard. I think Northgard came around maybe 2016, something like that. You have the war game series from Eugene that was also picked up quite a lot of steam there, pun intended. And then the Steel Division series a couple of years later. And so I think that like the RTS might have kickstarted the love of a lot of people for the strategy genre, but now they are the ones who are walking on the shoulders of giants, right? So they built the basis, and then other titles came along and they built the pillars, and now you see them trying to build the ceiling of the roof of that house. So I think it's a really cool transition, and if you think about it, it starts to make a lot of sense because you go from one, and then you leave some space, and don't forget MOBAs. I think MOBAs are very important here because MOBAs also brought a lot of audience, and people don't even. I think that the regular Joe that just plays video games, he doesn't even realize how close MOBAs are to RTS titles, right? So they don't even have, like, for example, all my friends played League of Legends, me too. None of them play RTS titles, but they all loved League of Legends. They played League of Legends for 10 years. And I think that some of these people also start to jump off to other genres or to other subgenres of strategy, and some of them eventually went on RTS. And I think that you just need to, like, if you look back at it, you can clearly see a progression as to why these games are making a return. I think this is like Steam and the massive success of Europa Universal, which Crusader Kings and XCOM cannot be understated.
So I think something you said there specifically about Steam allowing that. Al, I think you have some thoughts about that specifically when it comes to allowing indie games to be developed as well.
Yeah, Steam opened the floodgates to giving indie developers a market, which they wouldn't normally have. If we think back to certainly when I started playing games in the early 90s, it was a bricks and mortar shop, as Nuno puts it. You had to walk to your city centre to buy your games from a shop. But with the onset of Steam and other digital download options are available. With the onset of Steam, anybody. It's similar to Amazon publishing. Anybody can release a game on Steam, and I think this has given people. Do you know what? Hey, I can make a game. You know, me and my friends, we can make a game. We can release a title, and you probably find that the people who played real-time strategy games when it was the golden age are now a little bit older. They've got more time, more resources to invest, and I think, well, we're not seeing the titles released that we used to, or when they are released, they're not hitting the mark like nostalgia tells us they were like. So, hell, we'll make our own.
There's actually a really good example of something that worked outside of Steam that didn't go through that path, but that was Age of Empires 2, a fan-made expansion, Forgotten Empires. This was just a team of people that just made an expansion to an incredibly popular game just because they liked the game and they wanted to add something to it. And then they themselves got hired by Microsoft to continue making expansions for the game. And then they eventually released all that on Steam after the HD edition and everything like that. So even though it wasn't initially through Steam eventually enabled that as well. But it is like passionate gamers who love a game at home, who just out of the blue just thought, hey, let's add something to this. Let's make some RTS games. Let's do something, which I think is what drives a lot of this as well, because it's not how much money can you make from this game, but what do you enjoy? What's fun for you? What do you like? And that's the games that we really enjoy, that we spend so many hours with, and so on.
So it all comes down to money, doesn't it? It's quite interesting that it all comes down to money. If you look at the recent what you might class AAA RTS releases, Homeworld 3, You look at Company of Heroes 3. They've not hit the mark like their predecessors did. So big studios are thinking, why are we ploughing all this money into games which are not going to be commercially successful? Whereas on the other hand, indie developers are often, and I'd say 99% of the time, they're doing it because they love the games that they're making. They are passion projects. They are something that they believe in doing, rather than how are we going to make the most money. It's capitalism, you know. It's what sells is what's released, and this is why we're now on Call of Duty 11 or 12 or whatever it is, because every year it sells another 1 million or 10 million copies. So help, make another one.
Yeah, I think the reason why games like Company of Heroes 3 and Homeworld 3 fail is because, like, I think this is actually a case of a lack of innovation, because those are not bad games. They're just the same game you played 15 years ago, and that's like these companies forget that while they have big IPs, they're still competing with some very interesting titles this day and age. So you still have Age of Empires 4. So Age of Empires 4 is a great example again, because while it picked up the basic experience of Age of Empires 2, and I'm just actively ignoring Age of Empires 3, and just built upon it. If you look at Company of Heroes 3 went back to the way Company of Heroes 1 played and did nothing new. Like, can you, if you guys have played it, can you tell me something that it did new other than breaching buildings? So you have a mechanic which is breaching buildings. Does that really justify spending 60 euros or 50 euros or whatever in a new game? I don't think so, but nowadays you also have other successful games. So for example, I think that the largest competitor to Company of Heroes is Gates of Hell Ostfront. I don't know if you played or if you heard about it. It's World War II RTS in the vein of Man of War, and it's probably the most played World War II RTS at the moment. And why did they succeed when Company of Heroes failed? And don't forget, they also replaced Man of War as the go-to Man of War-like game. So they succeed because they brought in new mechanics. They did better graphics. They did massive campaigns. They introduced randomly generated maps. They have hundreds, if not thousands, of new units. They have custom-made campaigns. They have like a first-person mechanic, a third-person mechanic, which you can play. You can select and control each individual unit. And they did that really well. And when you compare like the offering of Gates of Hell that costs 10 euros on a Steam sale with Company of Heroes that costs 50 euros a year ago, you just go with Gates of Hell because it's a better game and it does World War II better than Company of Heroes actually does. And it's still an RTS. It has a massive modding scene. Oh, also don't forget about how successful mods can make a game. It's just a better game overall. And they're set in the same time period. They have exactly the same scenarios. They have exactly the same factions, but just one just does World War II really well, and the other just stopped creating new stuff and just got boring. And if you played Company of Heroes 3 in 2006 when the original came out, I can assure you would be mind blown. But nowadays it's just Company of Heroes again, same as Homeworld 3.
Well, with capitalism, if you have a very big investment, you need like a safe bet, right? And I think that's what happens with a lot of these AAA games. It's a safe bet. They don't want to risk it too much with something that might flop completely, and so they look at other successes and they copy it. I think everything you said there about Company of Heroes can be said as well about the new released game of Stormgates. It's a nice game. It's a good game, and it doesn't offer anything new than what 20 years ago was made. And I think there's so much to be done in RTS games. There's so many innovations to be had, and yeah, you're both right. Modding gives that, and I can give you a really good example, and I think you'll catch me say this a couple more times in the future, but Beyond All Reason is a community-made game from the ground up, entirely done by people who playing the game, enjoying it, and are adding, oh, you know why it would be really cool if this game had that hub. All right, well, they get behind their keyboard, they code it in, they add it, people like it, okay, it gets plugged into the game. And it's done so much for RTS innovation when it comes to the controls, when it comes to unit design and so on. So I highly recommend anyone that wants something fresh, something that controls very differently than these typical old style RTS games. It's amazing. The scale is huge as well. It has very Supreme Commander feel as well in terms of scale, but actually runs smoothly. Even if you don't have the greatest of computers, it runs really efficiently, which is a problem today with an older Supreme Commander.
Beyond All Reason is a throwback to Total Annihilation.
Well, yes, it is. But everything is a throwback, right?
It is. So what other games are we seeing either in development or recently released which are clones, for want of a better word, of our old favourites from the Golden Age?
You mean direct clones, or... Like, for example, I can recall a couple of games that are actually rather original if you think about it. And a game that kept popping up into my head while we were talking is the Starship Troopers games from Slytherin. I don't think a lot of people play that, but it's a really interesting game in the sense that I love games that pick up their themes or their time frames or what have you, and they stick with it and they build their mechanics around it. And I think that Starship Troopers is a perfect example of how to do an RTS game right while respecting its theme. It's just I think everybody watched like the movie, right? So you have like guys fighting against big bugs and a lot of action. Let's discard the political aspect of it, but just keep on the action part of it. How would you build an RTS around that? And I think what are the most important things while we're fighting big bugs? Line of fire, and how many guns can you put on target, right? And they built their mechanics around that, and I think the game plays perfectly with that. And how did they do that? So units can't fire over each other. You must use elevation to maximize your firepower. Each bug and each unit counters other units. So you need to round up your troops in order to not be destroyed. And I think games that do this, like, it's not an innovative game per se, because it still does the RTS fundamentals really well, but it picks up its theme and takes it to a whole new level. So it does it just... If you could build the perfect RTS game on Starship Troopers, it would be this one. And I think this is what Company of Heroes also did almost 20 years ago. It just they understood how people in World War II fought at the squad level, and they built mechanics around it. And now they just decided let's just start to add new stuff here, and you lose the essence of small unit tactics. Stronghold is another example of a game that it knew how medieval battles were fought, and it built its mechanics around it. And I think what you found today is that some titles, so Stormgate, for example, Stormgate just apes StarCraft, right? It picks up the StarCraft formula and adds new units. And when you are confronted with that, you just reminded that why the hell are you not playing StarCraft instead of playing Stormgate? Since StarCraft is a much better game and more established and has a higher player base, and it's probably way cheaper. And I think this
people were very excited about Stormgate.
Frost
Giant raised they raised $2.3 million on their Kickstarter. So there was clearly a huge audience for people who wanted to re-experience StarCraft. Why was that not as successful as StarCraft was?
Well, it doesn't have the IP behind it and all the story and the nostalgia behind it, and it didn't innovate. But I think and I think that was your original question, some that are looking to do that and I think are succeeding or will succeed is something like, for example, Manor Lords. Manor Lords brings a lot of elements from really old games, like such as previously mentioned Settlers or Strongholds, and like brings it into like a new way, and it's fun. Manor Lords is fun, and I think there's a lot more that will come to it, and it does it in a new way, in its own fresh way, and it's a bit gritty. It's a bit you have to survive. It has some banish in it as well, so it mixes it really well. And I think another one, for example, you called for a callback to something older, is Dorf, for example. Dorf brings back something old and then gives a very new, fresh elements to it, and I think that's what's needed. And yeah, to me, Stormgates just didn't bring enough freshness to it.
I played Tempest Rising, and I think it's a game that it actually starts to iterate a bit on what CNC and Red Alert formula was. And
did it not feel like you were playing Command and Conquer?
It felt
again?
like that, but with a couple of twists. And you see these things on the smallest details. And I remember, like, the first tutorial mission you had units that control drones, I think. And I just thought, like, man, this is so stupid, right? It's something so small that it just sticks with you, because I never saw another game do that. So you controlling a unit that's controlling another unit. And I think that for people who love micromanagement, which is not my case, they're going to love this, and they're going to optimize the shit out of it. And I think that you can build something really cool on top of this. And as long as you have the imagination and the talent to create something new. And I think this is what they're doing.
Maybe that's a good point to ask all of you. If any developers would be listening, what advice would you give them to include, to make, to not do in their upcoming RTS games? What advice would you give to developers?
Mod tools.
So isn't this just, and this is a very controversial opinion, isn't that just being lazy? You can release a mediocre game, and then you rely on your customers who have paid for that game to make it a good game. I mean, that's just tardiness, you know. Make a good game like what they used to do. You know, Command and Conquer was a fantastic game in '95. Red Alert '96, fantastic game. 2003, Total Annihilation. Dark Reign. Did you ever play Dark Reign? It came out the same year as Total Annihilation. Incredible games. So many innovations in terms of the way you could use your units. The again 3D maps. Fantastic. It's lazy to rely on a community to make your game playable. And I think that developers who do that should be kicked in the nuts.
I think that you only have a successful modding community if your game is successful in the first place, right? So you need to have a good game to build a basis from. But my advice would be stick to your team. Do your team, understand why people enjoy that IP, why they enjoy that particular time period, why they enjoy... why they might enjoy playing on your setting, and build your mechanics around that setting. And I think most games just fall flat because they build things from the inside out, so they just more likely so the outside in, so they just decide they have a couple of basic mechanics. So let's say I have Age of Empires and I'm just going to slap World War One theme on it, and it's not going to work because Age of Empires wasn't built to support that. So I think that you need to
but that process has failed. You look at the Command and Conquer series of games, and they steadily got worse, or even if they were better games, they were less well received because they just regurgitated. They didn't innovate. They didn't add anything new. You mentioned Company of Heroes 3 with the breach buildings mechanic, which was really the only innovation. You're going to have to try something new, and there is the risk, and this is why these large studios won't try anything new, because new brings the risk of failure. Doing the same thing brings the risk of burnout. So this is why I personally think that the future of RTS gaming lies with indie studios. It lies with the people like Stutterfox, who are doing Falling Frontier, which looks like a fantastic replacement for Homeworld 3. It looks incredible.
My goodness, it does. It does.
The Last General, Nuno and I have both spoken to the guy who's making The Last General. It's something so completely different. It's an RTS game, but it's so completely different to what we've seen in traditional RTS. But innovation has gone out the window because the studios that own these IPs or who produced these huge games in the past are so scared of failure that they daren't try anything new. So indie developers are our hope for the future of RTS games.
But that's a bit that ties down with modding as well, right? Because you can have 100 people make 100 different mods, and then it's all different risks that are not very big risk as a singular modder, but then the best ones comes out on top, and then that risk factor versus investment is a very delicate balance to have, I suppose. And either case, the extreme is not good, I guess. And a balance in these things with how much risk are you putting in versus how much are you putting in. But so yeah, I guess that concludes, I think, in broad strokes, what we thought of as the Renaissance, I believe, and what made it so good, what brought it back, where we're heading, where we would like it to head. Any upcoming games you're looking forward to play soon in the RTS genre?
Tempest Rising. I want to play Tempest Rising, but I don't think it's going to release this year, so I'm gonna have to keep on waiting.
Al?
If I had to pick one, it would be The Last General. It was due to come out this year. It has been delayed ever so slightly, but I think that's going to be an exceptional title.
Joe?
Some mad genius just told me about this game called Beyond All Reason. I'm excited to try that.
Wow, I'm very happy that I've already converted yet another one. You will not be disappointed. I believe, honestly, it is the future of RTS gaming. All right, well, yeah. With that, is there anything you would like to, anything else other than Beyond All Reason, of course, where you guys would like to direct any of the listeners listening from home, perhaps a personal project you're working on, or something that you've been making that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Yeah, I've got a movie podcast. We've only released our first episode. It's on the classic movie Sweet Home Alabama, featuring Reese Witherspoon. It's me and a lifelong friend. You can find it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The podcast is called Millennial Binge. That's Millennial Binge because her and I are both geriatric millennials, so we're very creative too. But we're having a lot of fun doing it, so look for us there.
Someone has also told me about a really cool website, rtshq.net. Can someone tell me about that?
Well, if you're an RTS fan, it is the place to be.
Thank you, everyone at home, for listening and joining us. And we will be here again next week for a new episode on fun, realism, and accuracy, and perhaps their mingling thereof. All right, everyone. Have a good one.
And don't forget to check out criticalmovespodcast.com for all of the information you need about the show and for ways to get involved. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.